So if you'd prefer not to be appearing on that recording at all, then make sure you switch your cameras off. But welcome. Yeah, great to see lots of you here. Thank you for joining us. We're sure to have a really interesting discussion. This is our fourth Pillars of Green Politics talk. You're all really welcome. My name's Johan. I'll be facilitating the discussion and introducing our guest speaker shortly. So tonight's discussion is going to be building on the last couple of weeks of this series. Any commitment to ecology and social justice, those key pillars of green politics that we've been talking about so far, really needs to engage with the scale of the environmental crises we face and examine genuine policy solutions. The science shows us racing by planetary boundaries across a number of indicators. We're falling short of a genuine commitment to meeting the 1.5 degree threshold highlighted by the IPCC. We're living through a sixth mass extinction of species around the world. Plastic chokes our oceans and our soils are crumbling beneath our feet. Meanwhile, the pandemic has exposed a broken economic model that fuels inequality. As Oxfam have just highlighted, the top 10 richest men's wealth has doubled whilst the rest of us are poorer. So tonight we're going to hear how capitalism's thirst for growth is driving these environmental, social, and economic changes. But if we organize an economy beyond growth, can we create a just and sustainable society? We're very, very fortunate to be joined by Jason, who's a leading academic and will be giving us an overview of this discussion in just a moment. Following the initial talk, we will again be using your questions to delve into the issues raised in greater detail. Jason will be speaking for around 25 minutes or so, outlining the drivers of environmental destruction, what an alternative may look like, and how we can get there. During the discussion, you can share any questions directly with me via the chat. We'll be gathering those questions behind the scenes and relaying them back to Jason after he has spoken. The session should wind up at around 8 o'clock or so. Jane is on hand tonight as one of our safeguarding officers, so if you have any questions or concerns in that regard, then please send her a message directly. Jane's also going to drop our safe spaces guidance in the chat. This guidance is in place at the meeting and we do expect attendees to abide by it. She's also kindly offered to support anyone with technical difficulties as far as she can, so if you have any problems then send her a message directly and we'll try our best to sort it out. If you require captions during the meeting tonight, then you can switch them on by clicking on the captions icon at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Jason Hickel. So Jason is a professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. He has written on a number of subjects from global inequality to degrowth, including two fantastic books, The Divide, a brief guide, to global inequality and its solutions, and Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. I thoroughly enjoyed reading both books and I would highly recommend them to both to you as they speak to some of those core issues at the heart of green left politics. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Jason.
Okay, thanks very much for the very kind introduction. It's very good to meet you all tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I try to limit the number of speaking engagements that I have because it takes away time from writing, basically. But I couldn't resist the opportunity to interact with people who are sort of engaged with kind of active grassroots struggle on these issues, because I feel that there are some crucial issues, matters of strategy that need to be discussed, that I'm looking forward to chatting with you about. But I'm going to spend the first kind of 20 minutes here, 25 minutes, giving kind of a very brief basic overview of degrowth thought. And the exciting stuff I'm sure will come in the discussion afterwards. Okay, so give me a second to share my screen here and we'll take it from there. Okay, is that visible to you then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, perfect. All right, let's get underway then. So, right, just to kind of set the stage on our existing trajectory, it's crucial to acknowledge the fact that, as Johan pointed out, we're very far from achieving the Paris climate agreement targets, right? So this slide gives an indication of this. We have historical emissions rising here in the black line. What is required to be compatible with keeping temperature rise under 1.5 degrees is a dramatic reduction in emissions to about half their existing level by 2030 globally, right? That's the green line represented here. The blue line here is our existing trajectory if we uphold all existing pledges and targets under the Paris Agreement, right? And this is updated since Glasgow, by the way. So as you can see, and this is surprising to most people, with existing pledges and targets in place, there's actually no reduction in emissions that is projected to happen at all between now and 2030, which is a dramatic failure of our world's governments to uphold the 1.5 degree target. Our current policy situation, like policies that are presently in place, have us on track for at least 2.7 degrees of heating by the end of the century. And that's optimistic because it includes assumptions about negative emissions technologies that scientists roundly reject as unfeasible. We'll discuss more about that in a few minutes here. So 2.7 degrees. So as our world approaches 2.73 degrees, what do things look like? Just a very brief overview of kind of existing scientific projections on this question. Rising sea levels, of course, between 1 to 2 meters by the end of the century. For most of us, that's more or less in our lifetimes, by the way. This is not some distant future. Species extinction. This one I always find staggering. At 3 degrees, we're looking at 30 to 50% of existing species on our planet being wiped out, which is almost too staggering to comprehend. Human displacements. In a 3 degrees world, at least 1.5 billion people will be displaced from their homes by climate impacts, which is an order of magnitude plus more. I mean, several orders of magnitude more than existing displacement under climate impacts today. Staple food crop collapse. The UN projects what they refer to as multi-breadbasket failure in a world warmed by 2.7 degrees to 3 degrees, with famines affecting several parts of the world, sometimes potentially even at the same time. And this is why climate scientists, including, for example, Kevin Anderson, one of the UK's most prominent climate scientists, routinely say that a world warmed by 3 degrees is not compatible with organized human civilization as we know it. It's very clear that this kind of disruption would cause institutions to collapse and would lead to significant social political upheaval. And that's not a future that we want. However, we're headed directly for it. So we call this the Anthropocene. This is the language that we often use to describe this catastrophe. And that language is useful in several respects to point to, obviously, the fact that human activity is causing this crisis. At the same time, the terminology is also incorrect because, very simply, it's not humans as such that are causing this crisis, but rather a specific economic system, namely capitalism, that is organized to the benefit of a very small number of states, corporations, and a small share of the world population. And this is perhaps clearest when it comes to the question of climate breakdown itself. If we look at national emissions in excess of the safe planetary boundary of 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we can get a sense for which nations have contributed to the climate breakdown that we're experiencing today and which we will experience in the future. And the results are as follows, and this is from a paper that we published in Lancet Planetary Health recently. The USA is single-handedly responsible for 40% of all excess emissions globally. The EU, including the UK, for 29%. And the rest of the global north, which is the rest of Europe, basically Japan, Australia, Canada, et cetera, is responsible collectively for 92% of all excess emissions, okay, that are causing climate breakdown. The global south, by contrast, which represents the majority of the human population across the continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Middle East, is responsible for only 8% of excess emissions, and that's from only a small number of countries. The majority of countries in the global south are still well within their fair share of the planetary boundary and have therefore not contributed to climate breakdown at all. So it's important that we understand this as a process of atmospheric colonization, right? Rich countries have effectively colonized the atmospheric commons for their own enrichment with devastating consequences for the rest of the world. And that includes the fact that that these consequences fall disproportionately on the global south, right? So the global south, we know, suffers over 90% of all costs related to climate breakdown, and suffers around 98% of all climate-related deaths. Okay, so virtually all climate-related mortality occurs within the territories of the global south, despite the fact that they've contributed little, if anything, to the problem. This is injustice on a staggering scale, which we have to pay attention to. Now, crucially, as Johan, of course, mentioned, climate is not the only crisis that we face. And this is, of course, represented in the planetary boundaries framework, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. This is, of course, the safe operating space here in green. And we can see that several of the planetary boundaries have been crossed already. And that includes novel entities, which is basically chemical pollutions and plastic and so on. Climate change, which is the obvious one, we're well over the safe threshold there. Biosphere integrity, which is basically species extinction rates. We know that species are going extinct at a rate of 1,000 times faster than prior to the Industrial Revolution. Land system change, which is primarily deforestation for industrial agriculture, mostly for industrial meat production. And then biogeochemical flows down here, which is runoff from chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which deplete soils and marine and freshwater ecosystems. Okay. Now, crucially, all of these other dimensions of ecological overshoot are being driven by excess resource use. And it's very important that we understand that our crisis is not just about climate, but also about excess resource use. And let's think about that for a second here. This is a graph showing global resource use over the past 50 years since 1970. The red line here is what industrial ecologists say is the maximum sustainable threshold for global resource use. Okay, we overshot that threshold beginning in the late 1990s. And at the time, there was some claim that, don't worry, with improvements in resource efficiency and technological change, et cetera, we're going to bring resource use back down. In fact, the opposite has happened. Resource use has accelerated in the 21st century, and now is nearly 2 times over the safe maximum threshold. And this is being driven by economic growth, okay? There's a very tight relationship, and this is one of the most important things to know about ecological economics. There's a very tight relationship between GDP and resource use, right? So the more you grow the economy, the more resources you extract and use, okay? There was some relative decoupling in the 1990s, which fueled, again, this idea that maybe we can have rising GDP and declining resource use, but that illusion was wiped away in the 21st century, where we've seen an actual rematerialization or re-intensification of the economy in terms of resource use, a kind of recoupling, right? So empirically, these narratives around green growth are mythical. Now, crucially here too, we know that resource overshoot is due almost entirely to overconsumption in rich countries, right? And we can see that when we look at resource use in per capita terms by country income group. Okay, so we have low income countries here, about 2 to 3 tons of material use per person per year. This red line again is the sustainable threshold rendered in per capita terms. Rich countries on the right here exceed that threshold by a factor of 4, okay? On average, about 28 tons of resource use per person per year. Now, what's extraordinary about this is that if the entire world were to consume at the level of high-income nations, we would need 4 planets to sustain that kind of consumption, right? By contrast, if high-income nations consumed like the average of the rest of the world, we would not at present be in a condition of global ecological breakdown at all. We would be more or less at or within the planetary boundary on resource use. Okay, that's an important fact to keep in mind. And crucially, excess resource use also has colonial dimensions. And let me explain this briefly because it's quite important for our analysis here. The key fact here is that growth in the global north relies on a massive net appropriation of resources from the global south, okay? And this should not be surprising to you if you pay attention to sort of the things that are around you, right? Your clothes, your technology, whatever it might be, recognizing that the resources and labor involved in the production of those things happen mostly in the global south, right? So this should come as no surprise, but we're able to calculate the scale of this net appropriation in quite precise terms. So we know that that every year, I'm having difficulty with my technology here. I'm not sure if, okay, sorry. So we know that every year the North net appropriates, and this is net of trade, right? Net appropriates 12 billion tons of raw materials from the global South each year, which is double the total extraction that happens from the continent of Africa every year, okay? 820 million hectares of embodied land. So that's land that's embodied in goods that are transferred from the South to the North, net of trade, right? That's twice the size of India. So that's land twice the size of India that is mobilized around producing things like sugar and cotton for consumption in the global North without any equivalent compensation in return, okay? 21 exajoules of embodied energy, which is enough, which would be enough to provide a high standard of living to everybody in the global South, right? Eliminating energy poverty permanently, but instead is organized around excess growth in the global North. And 188 person years of embodied labor. So that's about the size of Latin America's total workforce, which is mobilized around producing things for Northern consumption around the clock for the entire year. Every year, okay? Therefore, the South, and this is crucial, the South suffers the ecological damage of Northern growth, right? What this means is that the damage involved in Northern consumption effectively happens in the global South, where the extraction and the exploitation occur, okay? So you're not gonna see most of the damage happening in Finland or in Scotland, but you'll find it in Indonesia or in the Congo, right? But this also means that the South is actively deprived of the resources that are necessary for development, right? So things like materials, labor, and land are the essential use values that are required to meet human needs, to achieve sovereign economic development. And yet those are drained from the global South in order to service this kind of excess accumulation in the global North, okay? And the reason this happens is effectively because rich countries control the terms of trade through the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization, but I'm not going to go into that in detail now, okay? In light of all of this, in light of the colonial dimensions of ecological breakdown and the dual dimension of excess emissions and excess resource use, what needs to happen in the world economy and in terms of policy in rich countries? The first thing is that we know that rich countries need to achieve a dramatic reduction in resource use, right? Let me just call to mind again this graph that you saw earlier, showing the scale of excess resource use in the global North. So resource use in the global North has to be brought down by about 75%. This is not a small amount. This is quite dramatic. Now, crucially, this cannot be accomplished while pursuing growth at the same time. And the reason has to do with that very tight coupling between growth and resource use that I described earlier. Now, we can hope that green growth might occur and there might be a kind of absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use. But the important thing to understand is that all existing model-based projections that we have on this question reject green growth narratives. As long as high-income nations continue to pursue growth as usual, then resource use is projected to continue to rise, even under conditions of very high efficiency. And the reason basically is because under capitalist conditions, efficiency improvements are leveraged to expand the process of production and consumption, rather than leading to absolute reductions in resource use. Okay, so green growth narratives are basically baseless, empirically baseless. Okay, green growth is not a thing. So the alternative, of course, is that rich countries, and this is increasingly demonstrated in the empirical literature, need to power down unnecessary forms of production, right? So actively reduce forms of production that are not necessary for human welfare. Okay. Something similar is going on when it comes to climate change. We know that if we want to stay under 1.5 degrees, then CO2 emissions need to decline globally to 0 by 2050, right? But keep in mind that this is a global average target. For rich countries, given the fact that they've contributed the overwhelming majority of excess emissions, they have a responsibility under the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions to 0 much more quickly. A fair share approach would have rich nations reducing emissions to 0 by about 2030 or 2035 at the latest, right? So it's important to recognize that rich nations' pledges to end emissions by 2050 fly in the face of basic climate justice principles. Okay, they effectively amount to a continued colonization of the atmospheric commons, taking away atmospheric space from poor countries, right? This is not a tenable position. So the question becomes, is such rapid decarbonization possible, right? And the answer to this, and the good news, is yes. The difficult part is that it's not possible if high-income nations continue to pursue growth at usual rates. And just very briefly, the reason for this is because growth is very tightly coupled to energy demands, right? And we can see that in this image here, which shows energy demands, energy consumption, and GDP on these two axes, indexed in 1971, showing a very tight relationship between the two, a very consistently tight relationship between the two, I should add, okay? And this is, by the way, despite dramatic efficiency improvements over the past half century. What this means, this relationship between growth and energy use, means that growth makes it harder to achieve rapid decarbonization. The more we grow, the more energy our economy uses, and the more difficult, therefore, it is to roll out sufficient renewable energy capacity to cover that energy demand in the short time that we have left, okay? It's effectively like trying to shovel sand into a hole that keeps getting bigger, or trying to run down an up escalator, right? It sort of makes our task much more difficult. And this is one of the key principles of climate economics to understand. The more energy that we use, the more difficult it is to decarbonize. The less energy we use, the more quickly we can decarbonize, right? So to deal with this conundrum, to recognize, to sort of reconcile the facts that politicians want to pursue growth, but also have claims commitment to the 1.5 and 2 degrees targets, politicians increasingly bet on speculative negative emission schemes. I won't describe these in detail here. We can talk about them in the Q&A if you want to. But scientists, again, routinely reject negative emissions hopes as extremely risky. The main issue being that if for whatever reason this approach fails, then we're basically locked into a high temperature trajectory from which it would be impossible to escape, okay? And that's aside from all the additional dangers and risks that negative emissions at scale pose, okay? So here too, the alternative is something different. We need to actively scale down energy use in high income nations. And how do you do that? You do it by reducing excess production and consumption, okay? This is not just about switching to LED bulbs or turning off lights when you leave the room. I mean, obviously this helps, but the vast majority of excess energy use in our economy is driven by forms of production and material consumption, right? So it takes an extraordinary amount of energy to extract and produce and transport and process all of the material stuff that our economy uses. By doing less of it, we can scale down energy use and achieve a much faster decarbonization. So this is what's known as degrowth, right? Degrowth is simply a planned reduction of excess resource and energy use in high-income nations, designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way, okay? So in this sense, it's fundamentally different from a recession, and I want to emphasize this. A recession, obviously, is what happens when a growth-addicted economy fails to achieve growth. It basically collapses into catastrophe, right? People lose their jobs, inequality rises, poverty goes up, homelessness rises, and so on, right? Degrowth is very different. It's a planned reduction, specifically of sectors of the economy that are not necessary for human well-being, and is done in a way that is equitable and prevents any negative consequences for human well-being. And let me describe what this looks like. But I want to emphasize here that the key principle of degrowth, right, is that this can be accomplished while at the same time improving people's lives. We can improve people's lives with a fraction of the energy and resources that high-income nations presently use, right? And this is very simple to grasp when you recognize that huge chunks of economic production in capitalist societies are completely unnecessary for human well-being. And I'll talk about what this looks like in a second. So the objective needs to be to reorganize the economy around meeting human needs rather than around capital accumulation. Okay, so reorganize resource and energy use around human well-being rather than around capital. So the question becomes, how do we get there? Let's just think through this in a kind of stepwise fashion. The first step, of course, is to abandon GDP growth as an objective and change how we measure progress. GDP is a very dangerous and deeply problematic measure of economic welfare or human well-being. And the reason is because it counts the market value of everything that the economy produces, but does not count any of the costs associated with that production in social or ecological terms, right? So it doesn't count the cost of destroying a forest to sell wood to IKEA. It doesn't, in terms of habitat for endangered species or as a sink for carbon or whatever it might be. Okay, so even the founder of GDP himself, Simon Kuznets, warned that it should never be used as a regular measure of economic progress because it leaves out so much, right? And yet that's exactly what we do today. It's the central measure of progress for virtually every nation on the planet. So, but in addition to doing that, we also need to actively scale down destructive and socially less necessary forms of production. And this is really the kind of initial core of degrowth thinking, right? So the key is simply to recognize that in our existing economy, the assumption is that all sectors of the economy should grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need them. And what degrowth calls us to recognize is simply that instead, in an era of ecological breakdown, we should think more rationally about how the economy should work, right? We should have a discussion about what sectors we actually want to expand, right? So things like renewable energy production, public healthcare access, public transportation networks, et cetera. And what industries are clearly destructive and too big and should be actively scaled down. So things like SUV production, private jet production, right? Arms, industrial beef, fast fashion, and so on, like chunks of the economy that are irrelevant to human well-being, that serve only the interests of corporate power and elite accumulation, okay? We can also ban the practice of planned obsolescence, whereby capitalist firms design products to break down after a short period of time so as to increase product turnover, okay? Imagine if you were to legislate extended warranties on products so that they last 2 or 3 times longer than they presently do. That means that we would consume 2 or 3 times fewer, right? Without any loss to our access to the things that we need. That's quite dramatic, and that's a reduction in resource and energy use. We can introduce a right to repair to ensure that we can get products fixed cheaply without proprietary service. And we can shift from things like private cars and other forms of private provisioning to public transportation and other forms of public provisioning. In every instance that we have studied, it's clear that public forms of provisioning are less resource and energy intensive than private forms of provisioning. That's true for everything from recreational facilities to green spaces, to transportation, to water provision, and so on. Limit advertising. We have evidence that cutting advertising expenditures has a direct positive effects on human well-being, as people are exposed to less anxiety-inducing and destructive advertising messaging. It makes people feel like terrible about themselves, and also is associated with a reduction in resource use. This is a very powerful intervention that can and should be deployed. Now, people might agree that this sort of intervention is important, right? We can agree that there are unnecessary forms of production that we can scale down in our economy. But what prevents us from taking these steps is always the question, what about jobs? Politicians will never touch this issue as long as the question of unemployment looms, okay? Now, fortunately, post-growth and degrowth scholarship has long provided a very direct and straightforward answer to this question. And that is simply to shorten the working week, okay? So as our economy requires less labor to produce the things that we need, we can shorten the working week and share necessary labor more evenly, right? This can be, in fact, this can be used to effectively permanently end unemployment. So that whatever our economy needs to be produced, there's obviously sufficient labor to produce that, and we can ensure everyone has decent livelihoods. So long as we shorten the working, we can share that labor more fairly, right? This can be facilitated also with something like a public job guarantee or a climate job guarantee, paid at a living wage, to ensure that anyone who wants to can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, retrofitting houses, building renewable energy capacity, regenerating ecosystems, and so on. Okay. We can also expand universal public goods, and this becomes a very important part of degrowth thoughts. The key principle here is that if you decommodify access to not only healthcare and education, not only transportation, but also things like housing, energy, water, internet, and so on, it enables people to access the things that they need to live flourishing lives without needing high levels of private income to do so, right? So think about it. If housing prices were presently to double in the UK, that means we would all be under pressure to work and produce more, simply in order to access the same product that we need, which we used to access for half the price, okay? Similarly, if you were to decommodify housing, and housing was a fraction of its present cost, you would be able to work and produce less while still accessing the good that you need to live well, okay? So this becomes crucial to the possibility of well-being in a post-growth scenario, okay? Finally, reducing inequality becomes really essential here. People often ask me whether there will be enough income in a degrowth scenario to meet everyone's needs. And the exciting thing is that the answer is yes. In fact, there's always, by definition, always enough income to buy what the economy produces, right? And the reason is because income is simply the obverse of prices. It's the exact same quantity as the total quantity of prices of the products produced in the economy. There's always exactly enough, by definition, exactly enough income to buy everything the economy produces. So as long as we are producing the things that we need to live good lives, then there will always be, by default, enough income to purchase those things. It is always purely a question of distribution, right? So with a fair distribution of income, then you guarantee that people have access to the things they need to live well, even in a degrowth scenario, right? Income is literally not an object here. The only objects, the only obstacle is the question of distribution. And this can be addressed with very straightforward policies such as a minimum income policy, living wage policy, a maximum income policy, right? Wealth taxes, things like that, to achieve a kind of distribution of purchasing power in the economy, right? Okay, just concluding now, the upshot of this approach is that it's very powerful, actually. It enables a rapid transition to renewables, okay? As you scale on unnecessary production, you reduce energy use, and this enables a much faster transition to renewables. Not by 2050, it can be done much more quickly, by 2030 or 2035. That's feasible to achieve. It is feasible to keep temperatures under 1.5 degrees, with rich nations shouldering their fair share of that, right? In a degrowth scenario, okay? That's incredibly hopeful news. This can be done, as I've demonstrated, while also reversing other forms of ecological breakdown. So this approach not only addresses the question of climate, it also addresses all other planetary boundary pressures, okay? Because by reducing excess production, you reduce resource use also, and resource use is the major driver of ecological breakdown. At the same time, it ensures high levels of human well-being for all, right? So this is the opposite of the kind of policy that Macron introduced that hurt working class communities, okay? This is the bread and butter of a just transition. And most importantly, perhaps, it's in line with global South demands for decolonization, right? For at least the past 70 years, anti-colonial movements in the global South have recognized that growthism in the global North is organized along imperial lines, involves an imperial extraction from global South economies, produces deprivation and ecological damage in the territories of the global South. And they have been demanding that the North abandon growthism in order to liberate them from that extractive pressure and allow them to develop and meet human needs, okay? So degrowth is not just a demand rooted in ecological principles. It's also a demand rooted in the principles of global justice. And that's where the deep roots of degrowth thought actually come from. And so it allows us to align with the demands of our sisters and brothers in the global South for decolonization, right? Now, very, very briefly, but I want to discuss this more in our time together. The question becomes, what kind of political movements are necessary to achieve this kind of transition? What I want to emphasize here is that it's very clear to me that the environmentalist movement itself, the Green parties themselves, for instance, are not going to be capable of the kind of political power required to achieve this kind of transition. And the reason is well, basically twofold. The first is that they tend not to have a sufficiently radical analysis. Conventional environmental politics tends to think of the problem as due to individual consumption, right? So there's a lot of blame going on about consumption. And that's a very limited analysis that doesn't sufficiently recognize the deep drivers of the crisis, which is our economic system, our production system. It's not about individual behavior. It's about our deeper economic system, right? Individual consumption behavior is an effect, is a symptom actually of the capitalist mode of production, okay? And we have to recognize the underlying cause. Crucially also, it's impossible, by the way, to get working class movements on board with environmental politics as long as it's framed in the language of overconsumption, okay? Right? Because working class communities cannot identify with that because they are trying to make ends meet. They need more, right? In order to not be poor, in order to meet basic needs, et cetera. How can they identify with a middle class narrative of overconsumption? And so it's essential to have a narrative that recognizes the deeper structural drivers of the problem, right? Furthermore, environmentalist movements just don't have the political power to pull it off. In order to do that, they need alliances with the working class movements. Now that requires environmentalists to foreground the kinds of social demands that I've outlined here, right? Things like the job guarantee, the shorter working week, living wages, a fair distribution of income, universal public services, right? These are bread and butter issues that are essential to the well-being of working class communities. And without them, of course, any climate politics, any ecological politics will seem scary, right? And so it's essential that we take the question of unemployment and livelihoods off the table entirely by decommodifying that core sector of the economy that is so essential to human needs and ensuring that everybody has guaranteed access to that, right? This opens up, this loosens the political logjam and allows us to have a conversation about scaling down excess production without worrying about the specter of unemployment and impoverishments, okay? This is essential. And this is not going to happen on its own. This is going to require actively organizing with working class social movements, such as the labor unions, to build alliances around these demands, okay? And then suddenly this is a powerful movement. It has the power to affect strikes. It has the power to force incumbents to change course. It has the power to achieve radical reductions. A radical transformation of economic policy. In fact, this is the only political force that has ever in history managed to achieve such outcomes, right? Environmentalists simply cannot do it alone. Now, I should mention, this requires a change in the labor movement. The labor movement presently aligns with capital, bizarrely, aligns with capital in their demand for more growth because they believe that more growth is necessary to employment and decent wages, right? It's essential that we make the argument that it's possible and indeed preferable to pursue policy that achieves those objectives directly, rather than waiting for growth to solve the social problem, which of course it never does. achieve those objectives directly through the shorter working week and the job guarantee and the living wage, the minimum income, and universal public services. Those are the things we need to be fighting for, okay? And finally, I'll just close with this. It also requires alliances with social movements in the Global South. If you read the documents produced by social movements in the Global South, focused on the climate and ecological crisis, such as, for example, the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, drafted by thousands of social movements from across the Global South, you'll notice right away they have a much more radical, coherent, and sophisticated analysis of this crisis than anybody in the Global North mainstream does, right? It's important that we recognize their demands, we take their analysis on board, and we align with them in solidarity for decolonization and global justice, recognizing ecological breakdown has colonial ramifications and is playing out along colonial lines. Social movements in the Global South achieved one of the most dramatic transformations of the world economy through the anti-colonial movement in the middle of the 20th century. This is an extremely powerful block of movements, and it behooves social movements in the Global North, such as the Green Parties, the environmentalist movements, to create alliances with them, which are going to be necessary for the kind of coordinated global action that's going to be required for the transition we need. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that, and we'll have a discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wow, that was a really, really great overview. So thank you very much. I'm still sort of digesting bits and pieces here, but yeah, fantastic. And thank you everyone who sent me questions, but please continue to send me questions as the discussion, if it's, you know, sparks off any further ideas, really. So we've got a few minutes left. I'm sure we can, you know, potentially eke out a couple more as the discussion goes, but we'll keep it relatively prompt. Before we get onto, I guess, the sort of strategies for change debate that we kind of touched on at the end there, we had a couple of sort of clarification questions and discussions around, I guess, the nature of degrowth itself. And a few of these you touched on, I guess, briefly in your talk, but it'd be good just to sort of unpick them a little bit further, I guess. And so we had an initial question around GDP as a measure, and you obviously said that it's, you know, a very harmful measure. It includes a lot of things that actually aren't particularly useful in one sense. So what would you posit as an alternative measure? What should we actually be organizing our economies and societies around that actually reflects a sort of a sustainable and just approach to the economy?
Good. Yeah, I'm sorry I left that bit out. Yeah, so there have been several alternatives to GDP proposed. The most popular probably is one called the Genuine Progress Indicator, the GPI. And basically what it does is it effectively just starts with GDP, and then it subtracts negative social and ecological costs, okay? That's the simplest way to explain it. And so what that does is it basically gives you a more accurate or more meaningful picture of the true progress of an economy, okay? Recognizing both the benefits of production as well as the harms of production. So this is quite, and also natural asset depletion and asset depreciation and so on, okay? That's quite important. But I think that's even better than that, I think is something like a dashboard approach, where instead of hiding everything into a single indicator, which can be quite mystifying, actually, and can easily be fetishized. I think that's that identifying very clearly the kinds of things that we want to achieve and targeting those directly is very important. So, for example, if we want to achieve better wages or better healthcare outcomes, or better soil health, or less biodiversity loss, et cetera, then we should have these front and center for public and political discussion, set targets on those, and evaluate our progress with respect to those objectives, right? So this way, there's no speculation about, oh, I mean, is our proxy indicator working? I mean, it basically can't be games, right? This way, there's clear data in front of the public to make decisions about how well they think or people think our economic system is working against these core barometers of human and ecological welfare.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'd be interested, I guess, just very briefly following up on that, is if you think that can necessarily have the same, I guess, presence or weight in someone's mind as, you know, you see a GDP figure and you say, oh, it's gone up, that's a good thing, you know, is the sort of intuitive, the way it's presented. But if we have that dashboard approach, is that really going to sort of take hold in the same way, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's our job to sort of bring it into policy, isn't it? So, I mean, right now, like we're basically up against a kind of ideology, and this is quite important. Like we operate on an ideological terrain. We've been sold this narrative that GDP growth is somehow a reasonable proxy for human well-being or human progress, right? And that's a very deeply ingrained notion. And of course, this is cultural hegemony in the Gramscian sense, pure and simple. I mean, you couldn't get a better example of this. GDP growth is not a measure of human well-being. It's a measure of the welfare of capital. That's how it was designed to be. It measures only production of goods sold on markets. Does not, by the way, measure public services or anything decommodified. Okay, so and so therefore, for socialists or anyone on the left, it should not be a reasonable measure because it only measures what capital is interested in. It's wild that any socialist or eco-socialist would consider GDP to be a meaningful indicator. So, and yet we've been sold the notion that an increase in this indicator, which of course represents an improvement from the perspective of capital, somehow we're enjoined to believe this represents an improvement in the lot of the rest of us, which again is, I mean, literally the definition of cultural hegemony or ideology. So we have to fight that. And one way to fight that is to question the GDP indicator and point out that it's not fit for service. It doesn't do what we think it does. And we need something better and more rational. It's as simple as that. And I think that's, look, I mean, even mainstream economists widely recognize the problems of the GDP. That's not the issue. The issue is simply that there's a faction of our society, a class faction of our society that benefits prodigiously from maximizing that indicator. And that's the faction we're going to have to fight. Right? This is not like ordinary people are against this, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess sparking off something that you mentioned there, we had a question in, I guess, on the wider sort of relationship between being growth critical and the left generally. So you said that, you know, it's amazing for any socialist or eco-socialist to be you know, in favor of GDP growth or not to question it. But I guess we see that some may challenge that approach by arguing that it would be better to focus on capitalism as a system as a whole rather than growth within it, as you know, that could potentially that could be, you know, seen as more to do with individual consumption, which you spoke about, or it could be, you know, a sort of abstract industrialism rather than focusing on capitalism as a system in itself. So you've, in your writing, tied the two very closely together. Can you explain, I guess, why you think growth has to be seen within a sort of lens of capitalism, if that makes sense?
Look, the crucial thing here is that the critique of growth is sort of a gateway into a critique of capitalism, in the sense that it's very easy for people to recognize when it's pointed out to them that growth is driving ecological breakdown. I mean, this is widely recognized in the scientific community. It's widely recognized even in the political community and even among economists, right? Right. It's simply that they have a fantasy narrative they promote, which is simply that, don't worry, we'll be able to make the growth green. By the way, this narrative of green growth is just around the corner has literally been around for 50 years, half a century of being told that green growth is just around the corner, and it has literally never happened. So it's clearly time to stop listening to those folks. Okay. So once we take seriously this fact that growth is like a major driver of ecological breakdown, the major driver, it forces us to think about the economic system that relies on this, and that is capitalism, right? And the reason that it's so impossible for people to imagine a world beyond growth is simply because that requires imagining a different system than capitalism, right? Because capitalism cannot be sustained in conditions of no growth. It cannot be sustained in a steady state. Okay, so the way I see it is that the critique of growth is immediately also a critique of capitalism, and allows us a way to think about, like, as we think about what would a post-growth society look like, allows us to think about how to structure a post-capitalist society. And so this is much more concrete for people to engage with, rather than thinking about capitalism in abstract terms. We think about it in very real, physical terms, which is through the ecological crisis. And through the steps we have to take to avert that, we're able to come to conclusions about what a post-capitalist society might look like. And I think it's kind of a straightforward way into the discussion. And so I think that's why it's powerful. But yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I have nothing against those who who want to foreground capitalism as the main point of intervention. The only problem is that, look, there's also this tendency on the left to want a kind of growth without capitalism, right? So the idea, and this is very strange, it's very odd, it's like basically they say, we want, like the only real change we want in the economy is simply that workers should have control over the means of production, but everything else should basically remain the same. And this is not an adequate analysis. There has to be more, right? And the more emerges from the crisis of ecological breakdown and what we're forced to confront in the face of that, which is simply that beyond simply socialism, we must also have a socialism without growth in rich countries, because because growth rests on imperial appropriation, right? And is also driving ecological breakdown. So what we need is that socialism should be the horizon. Eco-socialism, should be the horizon, but degrowth is the way to get there. And we have to be able to unite these two perspectives. And that's why, yeah, I mean, this is, I think, quite central to an eco-socialist paradigm.
I think that's a really good way of framing it, that eco-socialism is the horizon and degrowth is the way. The Young Greens actually managed to pass a motion in favor of eco-socialism at our recent convention. So yeah, we definitely are on board with foregrounding capitalism as an issue of the ecological breakdown, as well as labour more generally. So I guess we've had a couple of other questions that kind of relate to degrowth as in itself, but I'm keen to discuss sort of strategies for change as well. So I might sort of ask two questions in one go. So we've had first one around degrowth and its relationship to the Green New Deal. We had a session on the Green New Deal on this political education series a couple of weeks ago. So do the two of those complement each other, or are they potentially in conflict? Because they might not necessarily immediately, it might not necessarily be immediately obvious. And then we also had a question on other examples of countries or regions that have done this well. So, looking at places like New Zealand or the Nordic countries, are they closer to this vision, or is that still some way off?
No, about the Nordics, no, they're a disaster. What's interesting, and this is actually a good example of the problem. No? The Nordics are great when it comes to social democracy. The key principles of socialism, they have managed to, I mean, beyond the fact that they remain capitalists, the key principles of socialism they've managed to sort of implement. Okay, they've been under attack by neoliberalism over the past several decades, but the idea of decommodifying kind of the core economy, the Nordics are very good at this idea, right? And a fair distribution of income, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, they're capitalists at the same time. And so in order to maintain capital accumulation in the Nordics, while at the same time ensuring like rising wage for the working class, they have to appropriate surplus from elsewhere in the world, right? And this is why they're sort of intrinsically imperial. They rely on a kind of imperialist rent now. So they need to abandon the objective of capital accumulation in order to be better at this. But no, I mean, they're, as a consequence, actually, their resource use is extremely high. One of the highest in the world, actually. They're up there with like the United States with extreme levels of resources. And that's simply because so much of Nordic economies are mobilized not just around meeting human needs, but also around capital accumulation. That's the problem. That's the sector they have to deal with. So about the question, okay, about New Zealand, I mean, have they done things right? Yes, one thing they've done right, which is quite exciting actually, which is that in their last budget, the government's promised that they announced they'd actually remove GDP growth as an objective for government policy. That's quite powerful. So this is the kind of thing that more governments should clearly adopt, and we should push for that in the UK. To the question of the Green New Deal, it really depends on what Green New Deal you're talking about. The Green New Deal as formulated by AOC actually is good. And like people like Naomi Klein were involved in drafting those ideas. It's good because it actually is not growthist, right? It's like it has many of the core principles that I've discussed actually in this talk. The problem comes with the way that it's been leveraged by some proponents, such as people like Robert Pollin, who's a pretty big figure on the left in the economic world in the US, to say that we should market the Green New Deal as something that will generate more growth, and this will get people on board, and we'll be able to pass it, et cetera, right? Of course, the problem with this is that if you leverage the G&D to produce growth, then you're having a rising energy demands, which is going to make your ecological objectives and your climate objectives much more difficult to accomplish. So pursuing growth works against your objectives, right? This should not be part of the deal. And plus, you can't justify additional resource and energy use, additional GDP even, when we know for a fact empirically that we can meet human needs at a high standard, much higher than what the US presently achieves with its mass poverty and inaccessible healthcare, et cetera, with a fraction of the GDP and resource and energy use that the US has. So what is the justification for more growth? There is not one. So now the European Green Deal is deeply growthist to its core and deeply problematic for the reasons I've described. The DM25 proposal for a Green New Deal is post-growthist, even degrowthist, and is actually one of the best examples of how you can have a synergy between degrowth and Green New Deal thought. And this has been studied by one of my PhD students, actually, Riccardo Mastini, who wrote an article called A Green New Deal Without Growth, which I'd urge people to take a look at.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. So I am aware, I obviously said that we would wind up by 8 o'clock, but we do have a couple more questions. So I might sneak a couple more in, but Jason, do let us know if you need to dash off. We'll just have a few more minutes if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. As long as I get.
So you kind of touched on it there.
I was just going to say, as long as I get a minute to offer a concluding thought, because there's something I'd like to say before I go. But yeah, I'll answer some questions.
Absolutely, that's very intriguing. So you touched upon discussion around. Sorry, I've got an internet unstable. Hopefully, you guys can hear me. So you touched on talking about well-being in your previous answer, and often we as Greens have sort of articulated our own growth critique. You see it in Parliament that Caroline Lucas, etc., has talked about a well-being economy, which I know is obviously a movement that's related but slightly separate. So, do you see the sort of critique of growth through the lens of moving towards a well-being economy as useful? And do you have a sort of wider commentary on the literature and the movement around a well-being economy in relation to your ideas?
Yeah, no, I'm a supporter of the well-being economy thoughts. And there's like a well-being economy alliance that I'm an ambassador for, and so I do support it. It's based in Scotland, actually, by the way. It's very cool. Make sure to check it out. But at the same time, look, I think that we need all kinds, and so we need donut economics, we need well-being economics, et cetera. But for me, as I see it, these are not adequate in and of themselves, right? We have to also have a clear conversation about degrowth, however you want to phrase that, but degrowth policy has to be in there, because we need not just well-being economics, but we also have to have a dramatic reduction of energy and resource use in rich countries. And that has to be front and center of our analysis and our policy thinking, okay? And so when people ask me about like, what's the relationship between degrowth and the donut of Kate Rayworth, of course, the answer is simple, right? Degrowth is the strategy for how you get rich countries back into the donut, right? So we can talk about the donut, but we also need a strategy for getting back inside that. And that's what degrowth provides. And so, yes, like all the principles of the well-being economy, which by the way, also include post-growth and degrowth thinking. It's just that I think that we can't lose sight of this core issue of degrowth, because it's easy even for capitalists increasingly to talk about, and even big corporations, we want a well-being economy, but and that's fine. But but we also have to have a conversation about degrowth. Otherwise, it gets very easily co-opted, right? Otherwise, you hear language about well-being economies from even oil majors and so on. And that's a problem. No? So we have to have like a stronger analysis, I think, there.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to talk about degrowth as a word. Often it can be, some people can react negatively, but actually it's not a word that can be co-opted in the same way as we've seen happen to sustainable development, for example, which if you look at the definition sounds pretty good, but everyone's in favor of sustainable development, and it's not quite turned out in the way that we would like to see. So I guess we've got a question on really the politics of this, and how do you see the politics of political parties? Obviously we're here as the Young Greens, but also social movements. How do you see them interacting with degrowth ideas, and what should we be doing, do you think, to really sort of take this, to understand the scale of this emergency and be putting forward some clear solutions to it?
Yeah, okay, good. So this is actually this is where I wanted to end up, so that's fine. So first of all, in terms of the word degrowth, I'm really not committed to the idea that everybody and all politicians need to be able to use that word publicly, or social movements. I really believe that it's context dependent. Okay, so and this question should be left up to social movements themselves, depending on your context. If you feel that it is a useful word, I personally do. I feel like it's a very challenging word. It's very clear. It's not co-optable. It's clearly defined in the literature. It forces a reckoning with core assumptions about our economy, et cetera, et cetera. I find it useful. If it's a situation where you have to spend a lot of time explaining it and you're at the podium and you don't have a lot of time, maybe you don't want to use the word, right? The key thing is that the principles and the policies should be in place. That's what matters, right? So I really urge people not to get hung up on the word. I think that in academic circles, clearly it's powerful. In activist circles, clearly it's powerful and increasingly useful. At some point, probably in public discourse, it will also be important and powerful. But you have to make that decision depending on your own kind of outreach strategies, I think. Now, in terms of what has to be done, this is just so essential. Like, here we are in 2022. Okay, 2 years into the crucial decade by which we're supposed to be cutting emissions in half. We're obviously nowhere near that objective. It's very clear that we're going to end up in a situation where 2030 rolls around. We realize that there's been a failure. Governments will increasingly lack legitimacy. But we don't want to be in that position, because by then it is too late, right? And so it's crucial that we have the difficult discussions now. It's crucial that we build the necessary movements now. So what does that entail? It's very clear that our existing trajectory, our existing approach, which is basically to maintain capital accumulation, to continue to promote growth and growthist narratives, and to hope that negative emissions technologies are going to save us in the future, or there will be a magic decoupling of GDP from ecological impacts, is not a sufficient response. Okay, so what is needed instead is a transition, is degrowth, is a transition to a dramatic reduction of resource and energy use. That has to be achieved. We don't really have an option. This is what has to be achieved this decade. And so we need to be able to organize to make that happen. And I'm increasingly confident that I just don't think that environmentalists alone are going to be able to accomplish this. It's going to require alliances with labor movements. And if there's one piece of advice that I give to any climate activist or any green activist, it's this: like, please, that organizing, that alliance building, that movement building has to happen this year. This is the year that has to be done, and it's not going to happen on its own. It's going to require getting to know people in the union movement. It's going to require giving presentations, changing your policy positions, aligning with core working class demands and foregrounding those. It's going to require building wall-to-wall solidarities in working class communities to ensure that when it is time for the kind of movement or pressure building that is going to be required to unseat incumbents, or to force them to change course, then you have that movement ready to go. And Extinction Rebellion alone is not going to cut it. We know that they can shut down bridges in central London, but they can't pull off the kind of mass demonstrations or mass political movements that are going to be necessary for this kind of transition. They just can't. Something like the anger of the Gilets jaunes, right? Something like the power of the labor movements can achieve that. But until there is that alliance built, and until there's communication with labor movement leaders about the possibilities for working class justice in a post-growth and degrowth scenario, then this movement is nowhere. It's not going to happen, right? And so yeah, I mean, this is the crucial moment. This is what has to happen as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if there's better strategies out there, then I'm very keen to hear them. But that's as far as I'm able to see, and that's what I think we have to do. So that's why I'm here tonight, really. That's the only reason I appeared, to say basically that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic, really fantastic note to end on. We absolutely agree with that need to build a wider social and environmental justice movement. We in the Young Greens, we've had been increasingly reaching out to unions. It was a core theme of our recent convention that we were discussing with unions on the ground, and that's something that we need to do. Obviously, we need to do more and more about. We have our Green Party Trade Union group as well, which is doing some really fantastic work. But again, this is something we need to do more and more of. So I think that's a really brilliant note to end on. And massive thank you, Jason, for a really fantastic talk. I just have a couple of quick announcements for everybody, so I'll let you go very shortly. But just a couple of things from my end, I just want to remind people of. So as we mentioned last week, we have our flagship activist training scheme, 30 under 30, back this year, which is great. And this is, a really exciting program. And I would really encourage any young green here to apply. We're really excited to be running it. It's a residential training program for 3 days, crash course in all things green politics, campaigns, elections, and much more. We're going to be trying to head down to Cardiff in April for 3 days of that. So please do come along. It's open to Green Party members that are 18 to 29 years old, or if you're a full or part-time student as well, then you are eligible to put yourself forward. If it means anything, I was fortunate enough to go to 30 under 30 in 2020, and it is the best thing I've done in the Green Party so far, so I cannot recommend it enough. The application is short, it's not too taxing, but the deadline is coming up very soon, so please get your applications in. You have until midnight on Thursday the 3rd of February to get the application in. And I would like to just emphasize that we're really keen to champion diversity in the green movement. So we'd be really encourage those from backgrounds that are underrepresented in politics to put themselves forward. We'll share the application form in the chat so that you can crack on with your applications and get them in the next couple of days. So yeah, we are fast approaching the end of our Pillars of Green Politics series, but we still have a couple of fantastic sessions coming up for you over the next couple of weeks. So next week on Tuesday, the 8th of February, we have a fantastic panel on international justice. We're going to be joined by 3 more brilliant guests for that discussion. We'll be joined by Ross Greer, the Green MSP for the West of Scotland, Benali Hamdash, who's the Green Party of England and Wales Migrant and Refugee Solidarity spokesperson, and Nanette Youssef, who's a Young Green councillor in Norwich. We're going to be delving into international justice as the ultimate manifestation, of a green commitment to non-violence. And this really builds well, actually, on the discussion that we've just been having, as we've seen how obviously an international system is built on inequality with the rules rigged in favour of the global north. So a commitment to justice must play a central role in any green left movement. So to make sure that you don't miss out, you can sign up for that session right now. We'll share the link in the chat so that you can RSVP straight away. And as usual, please share that link with anybody else who you think could be interested in the topic. We really want to reach out to as many people as possible and help build the movement. So we'd really appreciate it if you could share your thoughts about tonight's panel and about the rest of the series, really. So our click to tweet is being shared in the chat, and so you can really easily communicate how great this session was, and you can share your thoughts, which is really, really helpful again in attracting new people and getting the message out there, and so we can continue to build this movement of social and environmental justice. And then finally, if you enjoyed tonight or any of the sessions in our series, then please do consider supporting the Young Greens with a regular donation. Even just the price of a cup of coffee once a month, it shows your support, but it also helps put us in a better position so we can plan ahead and we can continue to put forward great events, campaigns and election activities to help win the political transformation that we wish to see. Greens aren't backed by the rich and the powerful, but we are a people-powered movement and we need people to come together in order to help spread our message. We'll share the link to make a donation in the chat, and we would be really, really thankful for any kind support that you could give. So before I leave you for your evenings, I just want to say again, massive thank you to Jason. You know, give your Zoom reactions, give your actual applause from your cameras. It was a fantastic session. Thank you very much. And then we will look forward to seeing you all next week, hopefully, and seeing you in the last couple of sessions of our series. But thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week.